It amazes me. Every autumn nature begins its fall, and the colors of the fall are all a spectacle many head out to witness. But have you ever thought about what is actually happening in these moments? There's a beauty in death, a beauty few can see, and most of these few are mystics. And the mystics all relate to each other around one idea, the eternal. A cycle has no end. If you take a line, you'll see 2 points, a beginning and an end. But if you take this same line and meet the beginning and end, you'll see that you'll have a circle, that cycle, pointing towards both wholeness and eternity. In the cycle of nature, autumn falls in an active period of removing, destroying, and clearing. Its opposite would be an active period of adding, growing, and filling, words that describe the spring. And it is the fall which leads to the passive, cold, bare winter, in which its opposite, the summer, portrays a warm, full season. And these seasons are all cycles of transformation in biological nature, not only expressing different shades of the same thing, the same nature, but all pointing towards the eternity of nature itself. And I begin with all of this to introduce the eternal psychic factor half of this video is centered on: thyself. A name used by psychologist Carl Jung to describe the wholeness of our psyche, our mind, in which I'll have more to say shortly. Now back to the fall. Ask yourself, what are you witnessing dying in the fall? Nature itself, what enlivens the roots of all things that you see, is not dying, as we all know that a circle continues through the winter into a spring and summer. So what's falling? Think about it. The creations, the fruits, the leaves of nature are falling. People are instinctually drawn to see the beauty of nature in the phase of it dying, because they consciously or unconsciously know that every end to nature is just its beginning. Yet if this is reversed onto them, that is, their fall, the fall of their attachments, their beliefs, their addictions, identities, personalities, emotional states, complexes, and the like, the individual struggles letting go of its constructed reality. There's nothing more natural psychically than becoming oneself. Yet nothing is more difficult in life than to know thyself. This video will be a bit different than my previous videos, yet I'm covering the same material. I want to highlight the dynamics of the ego and the self, or the subjective and objective mind. We'll explore their relationship, the archetypes and complexes within, the medium linking it all, and what it means to fall. And to do so, I'll of course be using the psychology of Carl Jung. All these ideas presented themselves through me in the scenes you see throughout the video, as I took a trip alone to Maine to enliven this content. I'll leave the specific location for the end to let those who have also walked these grounds a chance to guess at it. Before beginning, I do want to say that I am no one above you. I'm not here to teach, to look as if I'm some authority. If you connect with this material, know I have no teacher, had no teacher, and it is this same intelligence in me that is in you, if you allow it through. What I do, you can do, and what I say, I'm not attached to. Everything is open to discussion, so leave any comments below if you find any of these short explorations confusing or misleading. With that, let us begin a journey into the nature of the ego and the wholeness of itself. The names ego and self are just labels. They don't mean anything in themselves, but they're rather pointing to something invisible. When I call something green, we know exactly what this label means, as we can visibly see the color green. Of course, we can go deeper into the light spectrum to describe how the color green is green, but for the purposes of this example, I want to show you that when I say ego or self, there is no visible aspect to it like the color green. And because of that, when you hear ego or self, you may have your own preconceived opinions on what they mean. For example, many tie ego to being a narcissist, whereas many tie the self into themselves or the higher self, whereas the idea of the ego represents the subject, the willing individual, the center of conscious awareness, and the self signifies the totality of consciousness, the center of conscious and unconscious awareness, in which Jung coined the term. So while this may be a bit dry, we must grasp the invisibles the names are attempting to describe. Where should we begin? Ego or self? I'll choose the beginning of consciousness itself with the self. Think about it. There's a commonality to the birthing process biologically in every single human being born. Just the same, psychologically, we are consciously unaware. But in this unawareness, there is an awareness, a consciousness that will continue to be built upon. These rather pure grounds we all become conscious through as collective. In Jungian terms, this is the collective unconscious, with its latent potentials, its archetypes, awaiting realization. For a newborn on their first day, they have no idea about good or evil, right or wrong. In terms of awareness, a newborn is as open and as pure as it gets. But in terms of consciousness, they have no consciousness. They haven't discriminated enough to claim I am I. They're carried, they're fed, and it isn't until there's that transformation from being carried to carrying oneself when the individual is aware they are aware and able to act, will, in themselves and out into the world. So we see a difference between being conscious and being aware. In the beginning, everything is common. We're all aware. We're all not conscious. We're all not able to walk. We're all not able to talk. And it's important to reflect upon this consciousness, this unconsciousness in the beginning. Just as if one can look beyond race, color, what flag someone waves around, gender, and all the visuals, you'll see this commonality of the human being. The one with a heart, a head, 2 feet, and the like that biologically links us all as one. So when you look beyond all these psychological identities, ideologies, beliefs, complexes, personality types, and the rest, you'll notice that common quote-unquote fluid in which makes up all of our consciousness. We wouldn't all individually be conscious if there wasn't something common in its material. We all wouldn't love. We all wouldn't be angry. We all wouldn't have these similar thoughts and feelings. And so there is a self that is in me and in you. The only difference is the unfoldment of this self due to both objective and subjective factors. We begin as the self, which then through subjective discrimination we move away from our true conscious center to a new center. This is the ego. From being carried to carrying oneself. From being fed to feeding oneself. From crawling to walking. From I am to I am I. But in this new centering, the old doesn't vanish. The self still lies unconsciously aware in the true psychic medium. We lose sight of our true psychic center through the pull of the visible world and begin creating images, ideas around oneself, about oneself, and everything around it. Thus creating two potent archetypal complexes we all fall victim to: the persona and the shadow. This is because as a subject continues to build upon their beliefs, their opinions, their perceptions, anything that does not fit into their conscious subjectivity then becomes a shadow. As I said, the ego is the first complex from which all other complexes are formed. And thus the Jungian model of the psyche reveals itself before a child, an ego, proceeds ahead into its own conscious programming. Now, a couple more points on the self and the ego. First, the self. As I talked about the ego and its complexes, the self has its own innate patterns. This is the idea of archetypes. A major archetype tied to the self is the archetype of wholeness. Every single human being who has ever lived has had a moment of joy and a moment of despair. And if one strives for just a life of good, of joys, they will realize within an evil is building. This is what I describe as the law of wholeness. The more manly one becomes, the more feminine their soul becomes. We witness this phenomenon every time there's a rainstorm, as balance is nature's aim, and any force exerted by nature is to re-achieve balance. Every storm is formed because of a disturbance in the atmosphere. So we see how the storm is created by nature in order to bring the atmosphere back to balance. And you'll notice after a storm, the sky is clear, as balance is reclaimed. This exact process happens psychologically. Our weather storm is an analogy to a nightmare in the mind, as an imbalance must perform an action to rebalance the atmosphere. Unfortunately, most people ignore their dreams and their own psyche, living in a state of imbalance. And in this constant state of imbalance, it not only affects the mind, but also affects the body, as the mental disturbances create a stress that continues to manifest physically. Now, a few quick points on the ego. First, a quote by Carl Jung. And it's not just a quote I cherry-picked to fit the script, but the first sentence in his masterpiece, Ion. He wrote, "Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which require the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a supraordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness. And insofar as this compromises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. The ego is necessary for consciousness, as duality is consciousness, and without the other, consciousness ceases to be. So no one can be conscious without the ego. Think back to your earliest memory and see how far back you can go. There is a common, fuzzy, misty period which all of us cannot seem to remember. And it is because one has not yet differentiated itself. You hear a lot of people saying, kill the ego, there is no ego. But imagine the illusion of being egoless. You couldn't speak, you wouldn't develop. There is no consciousness. It is through the ego where the self becomes. The potential becomes kinetic. This is, in my humble opinion, the meaning of the paradox of the alchemist. The beginning is the end, but the beginning is a cheap, crude, baseless state, whereas the end is an enlivened and enlightened state. I said in the beginning that natural unfoldment of consciousness leads to the self, and it does, but the only thing in the way is the conscious subject, the ego. Yet without this other, the self would remain just a potential. Psyche is energy, and energy is not created nor destroyed. It just changes shapes and forms. In the beginning is the potential for wholeness, thyself, and in the end is the actualization of it. This is all and well, but many forget the missing link, and it's the ego in the world of creation in which this all may be. Just as the ego is a smaller subjective awareness to the larger objective awareness of the self, the complex is the son of the archetype. They are both innate patterns of potential energy, with a certain intelligence and force specific to each. The only difference is while archetypes were there in the beginning, complexes are built through the effect of one's own ego, or subjective awareness. There is no eternal factor to a complex, as they are created. And because of this, it leads us to a powerful reflection on these two unconscious potentials in us all. We cannot remove an archetype from our consciousness, yet complexes may be, as they were created, dissolved. I find it so telling how unconscious we are as humans when I reflect upon the idea of complexes and archetypes. We will get to complexes next, but first a thought experiment on the archetypal. Have you ever noticed biological archetypes that are innate in every human being, with the ability to turn what's potential into kinetic? A potential mode of functioning becomes an actualized mode of functioning. For example, the ability to walk. Think about how many children, without education or consciousness of language, develop the ability to walk. There's a certain instinctual intelligence already there, and through the subject's experience in the world, it becomes developed and actualized. It is only through this unfoldment of walking where higher functions related to it, such as running, may form. We so easily, instinctually, all unfold this biological potential in us, yet haven't been able to look within to see the inner archetypes, not based in biology, but in psyche. We all love. We all have this instinct for an embrace, a unity. Yet if this remains undeveloped, if the ego is ignorant of its eternal reality moving through us all, love will actualize itself childlike, complex itself into lust, and form into conscious reality all the distortion and attachments that go along with it. I find our race, through various means, stunting our psychological growth, and a big part of this has to do with the ignorance of our own deeply rooted instinctual modes of behaviors. And it is psychology who is supposed to objectively look at the psyche, but instead they've shifted towards the ego's distortions of it. And there's nothing wrong with focusing on this side of the mind, as we will get into this important aspect to the one side of psychology when we explore the complexes. But what about the other side, the idea of the objective psyche itself? On this side of the psyche, say the spirit of consciousness, the scientists balk. There is no denying we have achieved physical wonders through science, but in the space of the mind, we have not a clue. This other side of the mind seems to always be left for others to explore, such as those interested in religion, spirituality, philosophy, and mysticism, and all the myths and stories that such individuals produce. While the images and forms may look different between each, all have an archetypal root. This is why anyone who gets into the work of Carl Jung will see countless examples of such. He, while also interested in the ego and its complexes, had a true eye towards the collective, objective psyche itself. While everyone is focused on the ways in which one can distort their heart, Jung was interested in the heart itself. While I will not go into specific archetypes and the names we form around them, as this video will last an eternity, one can get a good grip on their reality and how they develop in the Red Book. As Jung, through his willingness to open his ego towards the inner world, allowed archetypal figures, as well as his own complexes of them, to enter consciousness just as it does in a dream. Outside our ego, within the space of psyche, there's semi-conscious, unconscious energy that wants our attention, and without our willingness to pay attention to it, they remain as they are, and affect us to the same degree as they are. Archetypes are so important to grasp because they are tied to the function of consciousness, even as they lie within what is known as the unconscious. Because when they become active, they instinctually or consciously function through the conscious, aware subject. Jung so simply and eloquently provides us the connection between conscious functioning and the archetypes. The term archetype is not meant to denote an inherited idea, but rather an inherited mode of functioning, corresponding to the inborn way in which the chick emerges from the egg, The bird builds its nest, a certain kind of wasp stings the motor ganglion of the caterpillar, and eels find their way to the Bermudas. In other words, it is a pattern of behavior. It is only through this deeply rooted, unconscious, organized structure of consciousness where one can begin not knowing who they are, but what they are. So outside our subjective will, there is another objective factor to the mind in which we have no control over. These possessive, yet necessary functions which lie in us all, will us all. And this may be too much to handle. But I look at it like this. If there's an intelligence in us, as well as around us, and it has been there longer than the few years that our subjective awareness began forming opinions, it may have a thing or two to teach us. And I think because of this, the most important thing to do with the archetype is to experience it yourself. They happen through you, not through me telling you. And when they happen through you, not only do you develop through them, but they develop through you. This is what Jung learned in the Red Book, and this is the power of doing the inner work. The ego is more important than we give it credit. Without our conscious awareness, the background, the depths of our consciousness, the place of instincts and reflexes will remain childlike, undeveloped. It'll be a seed withering in the soil, playing out the same motions over and over and over and over again. And that individual remains psychically stuck, halted, unable to grow, unable to sense, unable to allow consciousness to expand. But just remember one thing, you can't get rid of the archetypes. Archetypes are to be developed, while complexes are to be dissolved. Unlike the eternal, we have some control in creation, and it is not the collective unconscious, but personal unconscious, that space of our complex programming where any true work begins. Just as it is easy to diminish the ego or forget about its importance in consciousness or play the intellectual game of killing it, the complexes fall to the same fate. Every awakening journey seems to stumble on this one issue, and it's because we've trapped ourselves in ourself within every complex. So every look outside for enlightenment, for awakening, even for psychic balance is no use. Think about how many people look to a savior for healing, a religion, a guru to provide the correct discipline, a therapist, anyone or anything outside them. It's easy to pass the psyche off. And even if it's not a conscious pursuit to purify the mind, to awaken, we unconsciously look outside for inner fulfillment. If I just have this job, this marriage, this car, this fame, this success, I'll be settled. I'll be happy. I'll be at peace. Meanwhile, the unique complex situation in which you yourself are remains the same, lying with a potential energy within the unconscious, awaiting to play itself out again. Any self-knowledge begins not at looking away towards something or someone, but at what actually is. And in what actually is a part of you. We can go on about the names of complexes, the ways in which they cause certain behaviors, different formulas to try to fix it all, but it's no use unless we look at its beginning. Energy is not created nor destroyed. It only changes shapes and forms. Our psychic energy as a totality, the self, cannot lose or gain energy. So the energy trapped in a complex is psychic energy from the totality of consciousness. Jung calls complexes splintered or split off part of the psyche. Although unconscious, or rather semi-conscious in itself, it's still part of the whole psychic system. This is why any idea of self-knowledge begins with the complex in the individual. And it's only through the creator of the complex where its information can be integrated, energy released, and higher states of consciousness can unfold. This idea is mirrored by Jung, as I found this quote rather numinously a few hours after writing down these thoughts on complexes and self-knowledge. I randomly opened to Mysterium Connotationes, and my attention was drawn to paragraph 283. as if Jung winked back. It reads, "It is worth noting that the animal is the symbolic carrier of the self. This hint in Mayer expresses the fact that the structure of wholeness was always present, but was buried in profound unconsciousness, where it can be found again if one is willing to risk one's skin to obtain the greatest possible range of consciousness through the greatest possible self-knowledge, a harsh and bitter drink, usually reserved for hell. The throne of God seems to be no unworthy reward for such trials, for self-knowledge, in the total meaning of the word, is not a one-sided intellectual pastime, but a journey through the 4 continents, where one is exposed to all the dangers of land, sea, air, and fire. Any total act of recognition worthy of the name embraces the 4, or 360, aspects of existence. Nothing may be disregarded. When Ignatius Loyola recommended imagination through the 5 senses to the mediant, and told him to imitate Christ by use of his senses, what he had in mind was the fullest possible realization of the object of contemplation. Quite apart from the moral or other effects of this kind of meditation, its chief effect is the training of consciousness, of the capacity for concentration, and of attention and clarity of thought. The corresponding forms of yoga have similar effects. But in contrast to these traditional modes of realization, where the mediant projects himself into some presubscribed form, the self-knowledge alluded to by Mayer is a projection into the empirical self as it actually is. It is not the self we like to imagine ourselves to be after carefully removing all of the blemishes, but the empirical ego just as it is, with everything that it does, and everything that happens to it. Everyone would like to be quit of this odious adjunction, which is precisely why in the East the ego is explained as illusion, and why in the West it is offered up in sacrifice to the Christ figure. This quote captures a lot of what this video is focused on. You'll see that there's truly no self-knowledge without looking at it as it is, and that includes its complexes. Just like a seed doesn't become a flower without roots and stems, the mathematician can't perform calculus without knowing how to add or subtract. One will never know thyself if one can't get past their complexes. The tricky part of a complex is that although its effect occurs through consciousness, it may not be from our own doing. But the beauty of it, if I can call it this, is that while the complex may have been something created that we're not consciously aware of, say in our childhood, it never leaves. And it sounds weird to say this is beautiful, but since it's there, we can get to know it. Again, it's a part of you. And if one doesn't get to know it, well then it haunts one until the day they die, because if it's never realized, it can never change. This is why Jung coins the term shadow to explain the personal unconscious. So to try to visualize the invisible complexes in us all, I want to illustrate its basic structure using the concept of a bow and arrow. This will not only help us understand the structure, but also what happens when complexes become active, triggered into conscious awareness. In order to have a complex, there must be a central idea or theme. This is the most difficult to see for the individual because it becomes covered up by various associations, images, and emotions. But there is a fixed root which all this psychic energy is focused around. This will be our bow, the stable form or pattern of information that this complex is centered on. And it is, of course, held in place by energy, which one could say was drawn in by the initial effect or feeling tone of this central theme. The feeling tone is represented by the string in which is connected to the bow and the arrow sits on. So one can visualize how a complex will have more potential energy as that string is pulled further back. The arrow contains the psychic energy or intelligent energy of each complex, which affects the conscious mind. These are the behavioral patterns, thoughts, emotions, bodily reflexes, anything that overtakes the willing subject related to the complex. And of course, this whole system, the bow, the string, and the arrow, is located in the personal unconscious, and that arrow is pointed straight at conscious awareness, the ego. In order for the complex's psychic energy to reach consciousness, it must either be stimulated by a stimuli, say a person, place, thing, piece of music, anything from the outer world, or that energy slips through from within when the conscious mind is not active, say in a dream during sleep or in a vision during meditation. And when a complex is active, it floods the conscious mind with its own energy or emotion and information or intelligence. And it thinks and feels itself as it is through conscious awareness, regardless of what the ego thinks and feels about it. And it is only when the complex presents itself as it is, and the ego experiences it as it is, when transformation is possible. So as the arrow is headed towards conscious awareness, there's now 5 possible outcomes. This is, say, the kinetic side of the complex compared to the potential we just spoke on. And out of all these 5 outcomes, there's only one in which transformation may occur. The first reaction by the ego to its complex is a rejection. One may find another stimulus to force the complex away: entertainment, drugs, food, sex. Regardless of the conscious action, that complex, its energy and intelligence, is then sent straight back to that source in the personal unconscious. In terms of consciousness, we could deny all we want, but the psyche and the unconscious does not work like this. In its rejection, it doesn't just fade. It rather returns right back to its source. The second reaction by the ego is a projection. This is a bit better in terms of consciousness, as the complex is allowed to play itself out in consciousness. But the only thing is, one is placing that information, that arrow, that energy behind the complex to another. This action allows the complex to play out, regardless if one sees it in their self or not. And to the unconscious, this is agreeable, and the arrow returns to its source. Third reaction to a complex by the ego is a possession. As weird as this may sound, this is another step in the right direction in terms of consciousness, as one is allowing a trapped energy, a trapped consciousness to play itself out. But since one is so contained in it, is it in the moment, they cannot see through it. Of course, to the unconscious, this is another agreement to the complex, and that arrow returns back to its source. And you see in these 3 examples, everyone's falling victim to the complexes. They're feeding the energy or agreeing with them. Now, in order to begin the process of reacting the final 2 ways in which transformation is possible, there must be a will by the individual and a truer sense of awareness. And this will is no easy task, because again, we can't go to the complex. It has to become active. Sitting around meditating is beautiful, but how much complex can be activated? Living life, just simple living every day, is much more effective in releasing these trapped energies. And I say all this because the next reaction an ego can have is a reflection. But in reflections, they happen after the complex is activated. The complex is already back in the personal unconscious, semi-consciously awaiting unfoldment. And since it's only after we witness its movements and our unconscious tendency is tied to it, we're not able to transform it in the moment. So while there's no transformation to the complex specifically, what the reflection allows the conscious individual to do is to become more aware. And in this heightened awareness, it allows the ego the ability to catch it the next time it's active. And it's in this final reaction to a complex, say catching the arrow, in which transformation is possible. Because when that unconscious potential becomes active, and it's active but the ego doesn't become possessed, doesn't push it aside, doesn't push it onto someone else, doesn't reflect on it afterwards, but actually catches it in the moment, then that energy, that information becomes transformed. And in it, that energy is released back into its source, not into the unconscious, but its true source, the self. As much misery, as much disgust, as much as we don't want to see our complexes, there is a certain intelligence, not a universal intelligence, but a personal intelligence that helps one forward. And without this step, this complex step on the way of individuation, there is no archetypal unfoldment. There is no knowing thyself. There is no inner life. But in all that I've presented, from the ego and the self, the complex and the archetype, I've left a massive hole. It's a link that brings it all together. I wonder if you've caught it. If the ego is the center of the conscious mind, and the self is the totality of consciousness, which is both conscious and unconscious, then what's at the center of the unconscious, subject to the complexes of the ego and the intelligent potential of the archetypal self? Triangles have helped me begin to see past duality towards the eternal, the archetypal of it all. If you see a triangle, you'll see two ends that are equal below one single point. In terms of consciousness, I like to place the self at this one point, the monad. Below are its opposites. We have the conscious or the ego, and the unconscious, to which I've yet to name. One can use this triangle to explain any monad, any archetype, anything not created. Take, for example, the archetype of the mother. At the top will be the idea of the mother, the archetype, and below will be its two ends, the great mother and the evil mother. And you see how this helps center oneself. As if one sees the mother archetype, they may just gravitate towards the good side and deny the rest, whereas the archetype itself contains the whole of it. And for true intelligence to unfold, for the psyche to be, we have to be whole. The self is a monad in which all opposites are united, as all is contained in it. So we can begin to grasp the shades of our being by simply reflecting on the triangle. The self contains a light and dark side, a lower and higher self. It's beautiful and ugly, it's chaotic and orderly, masculine and feminine, active and receptive. So this brings us back to the whole in the video. The monad of consciousness, we'll say, is the self. Below is the conscious ego. But what's unconscious? At least in this video, I'm going to use the term soul. It's a name tied to many meanings, but I name it to signify the unconscious because our unconscious is us, and many connect that term to their own being. The ego, attempting to know thyself, can never reach it without the soul. Through the other, it will begin to be known. And in this next illustration, you'll see just how much soul is contained in your conscious reality. I'll set up a scene which highlights everything we've discussed up until now. We'll have a man and a woman, as well as their souls portrayed. The points above signify the ego, conscious awareness, and the points below signify that conscious aware's soul or unconscious. Both man and woman have unique souls and egos individually, while all contained in the same psychic essence, the self. A man and woman both have archetypal modes of functioning for relationship, love, procreation, and this in turn moves the soul toward it. But let's say this man has been affected in his youth to build a complex around love with a central theme. This then is, of course, unconscious, part of the soul. So if this man then sees a woman who stimulates this part of their soul, the soul then projects an image into conscious awareness with emotions to go along with it, all about the woman. In this we see the ego, the man, in conscious awareness, is not actually seeing the woman for what she is, but their soul's image of the woman. And of course this placement cannot happen with the will of the subject because it all happens at once, without intention, again by the soul. And what can happen is if the ego then forms a relationship with this woman, and he begins to see who the woman really is, and that image begins to fade, one who thought they were in love falls out of love. The illusion loses its essence, and true essence begins to shine forth. Now, in order for the man to see the woman in herself, he must of course look towards that source, its soul. This is what Jung describes as incest, because it's union with one's soul when thyself is awakened. Think about all the instances where you look back and wonder why you acted in a certain way in a moment, especially those unexpected moments. You obviously didn't choose to act that way. If you did, you wouldn't be confused by it. And even if you wanted to change, how do you have time for it? The moment doesn't have time for you to think it through. So if it's you in that moment, but you didn't do it, then one could say that's their soul. It is so easy to look back in anger, in hatred, in denial at our behavior that's past, but it's all you. And when you can see you in you and purify it out of the way, you'll see that true beauty in the disgust. Because as much as our soul acts out ourselves we wish to deny in moments, it also has your back. It is what acts in the moment to save people's lives. It has superhuman strength. It slows down time to make a decision that the ego couldn't fathom itself. There's a deep intelligence rooted in it. After coming to the grips with the realization of the other and experiencing it through reality, I began to look back at moments where it was there, but I never noticed it. I was just too full of myself. I'll go through 2 examples quickly to show you proof of a soul, a proof our world so desperately needs. In the first situation, I was running after a foul ball in baseball at full speed with every sense of attention directly towards the ball. Suddenly, my attention was directed to a pole, which I then avoided a direct hit to my skull by sliding my leg into it. The second situation is a car accident, where I'm driving 50 miles per hour and a car pulled out in front of me to drive on the other side of the road, without noticing me. In the first situation, something directed my attention to the pole. And not only this, but it had the intelligence without me thinking to slide instead of hit my head on it. And I was so close to the pole that I didn't even make it to the ground to slide. But I was in the process of sliding, and the hit was so hard that my shin broke in half and came through my skin. But it's better than my head. In the second example, it's a little bit of a different story because my attention was already drawn out to what is in front of me. But what's unique about this situation is the speed in which everything happened. It was as if time was warped. Because the car accident happened in about, I'd say 3 to 5 seconds. But of course in the moment, just like in a dream, time didn't feel this way. A car pulled out in front of me as I was driving straight to head into the other lane, and I remember everything slowing down. I knew it was going to hit me, and I knew I couldn't do anything about it. If I moved to the left, my car would have went straight into a ditch, and if I moved to the right, their car would have hit my driver's side door directly. What I remember was watching myself move the car just enough for the other car to hit my passenger side, and although my car was totaled, I walked away from it, and I was still able to go to the event, which was a concert that I was heading toward. And in both situations, you see that deep intelligence of the soul, not only in its ability to sense when we're not sensing, and not only the ability to act or move in a situation that has no time to think, but its care, its ability to keep us safe. And it's to the same degree that nature brings forth its forces to bring back balance. But if a soul is lost, thinking balance is found in the ego's complexes, then no true balance will ever be found. Inner work, soul work, incest with oneself, whatever you want to call it, it's an eye-opening experience. An experience many describe as religious. Jung writes, "For an equilibrium does in fact exist between the psychic ego and the non-ego, and that equilibrium is a religio, a careful consideration of ever-present unconscious forces which we neglect at our peril. And all of this can only happen if one can accept the fall it requires." When one steps aside, falls out of center and back into its true place, consciousness has the space to be as it is. Consciousness itself is not looking for good or bad vibes, comfort, misery. It's not interested in programming itself into some habitual ritual it runs over and over and over again. Consciousness wants wholeness, but of course consciousness is not whole if one is full of itself, because this fall is really an emptying. As the ego is empty, it's allowing that space of consciousness to be. Reflect on the Christian symbolism, the images that have been with the West and its soul for thousands of years. When one is baptized by the Holy Spirit, they're lowered into water. And if you think of this consciously, that is that conscious mind, the ego, being purified by its own essence, say the unconscious or soul. In the soul is the intelligence of the self, of nature, of eternity. It's all there, but it's covered over the conscious mind's images, complexes, attachments, the garbage of its illusion. And in this, you have the beautiful karma to see what you yourself created. Yes, you didn't mean to. Yes, your situation's difficult. Yes, this person did this to you. Yes to all that talk. But to consciousness, to eternity, nature, it could care less. And it will eat you up in your victimhood. You see how easily the soul can be lost, a lost soul, and how finding it brings through an inner and even an outer or bodily healing that no doctor can prescribe. You see how intelligent you actually are, how connected you are to others, to the world, to the universe. You begin to see how others act because of their lost souls, and how soulless our times have become. You see the illusion in it all, and in that you see the truth. An individual can play all the games they want with you. All the surface can shine, the money, the clothes, the facelifts, the makeup, the flashy watch, the car, the whole thing. To someone who lost their soul, okay, that'll work. But to one of us, anyone still listening to this video at this point, when you fall out of the illusion and back into yourself, that intelligence pierces straight through all the glitz and glamour that the world provides. When you think back to our earlier example, when that conscious and unconscious begin that union, you could see how the soul now is not placing images that has been distorted onto people, but they sense the soul in the person. It goes straight through the surface. We're all one. But before one can see the wholeness of it all, to have that kind of connection, they must realize the two. Knowing thyself is a journey through the ego and its soul. Look outside, and the wolves will eat you dry. You'll be programmed to be a beautiful consumer by the propaganda. But if one stays steadfast with their own essence, allowing it to develop into the intelligence that one actually is, not only will you see right through the wolves, but you'll also see the sheep, and why they're wolves and sheep. The fall must be if anyone is interested in living in accord with nature. I fell a few years ago because I was sick of half-truths. They're as real as truth in themselves, just as a complex takes over and grips the subject, the individual. But the difference is they're not real. I was so sick of living a life that was making me sick, and those around me sick. I saw so many people just lifeless, soulless, left empty at the end of it all, sucked dry. Is our system we are all mindlessly giving our souls to, allowing for psychic unfoldment? And so, with these thoughts, it is the nature of life I rest my consciousness on, as it is everything that we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, and sense. And because of that, no person, no government, no myth, nothing can give it to you, because it's already there. I'll leave you with this quote, a quote found in Ion, which speaks on the purpose of why consciousness itself was even created. Jung wrote, "Man only knows a small part of his psyche, just as he has only a very limited knowledge of the physiology of his body. The causal factors determining his psychic existence reside largely in unconscious processes outside consciousness. And in the same way, there are final factors at work in him which likewise originate in the unconscious. Freud's psychology gives elementary proof of the causal factors, Adler's of the final ones. Causes and ends thus transcend consciousness to a degree that ought not to be underestimated. And this implies that their nature and action are unalterable and irreversible, so as long as they have not become objects of consciousness. They can only be corrected through conscious insight and moral determination, which is why self-knowledge, being so necessary, is feared so much. Accordingly, if we divest the opening sentence of the fountain of its theological terminology, it would run as follows. Man's consciousness was created to the end that it may recognize its descent from a higher unity, pay due and careful regard to the source, execute its commands intelligently and responsibly, thereby afford the psyche as a whole the optimum degree of life and development." The gift that consciousness is an experience of a lifetime, and what we all do to it, and what we do to others because of our distortion of it, is as devastating as the lifetime is beautiful. We reached out and grasped a ton of the world for our benefit, but the opposite is calling. So for the sake of it all, fall. If you would like to help support this message, please share this video. All support is appreciated. With that, stay humble.